Dr. Anabel Mailer is a professor of music theory at the University of British Columbia and one of the world's leading academics on sign language music. Late last year, Oxford University Press published her book, Seeing Voices, Analyzing Sign Language Music. I'm happy to welcome her on the show today to talk all about her work and her book. Starting off with the big question, what exactly is sign language music?
There's a number of different types of sign language music. So probably what a lot of people have seen is translated sign language music. So if you've ever seen a video, these videos go viral periodically where you see an ASL interpreter at a concert, like Chance the Rapper or Kendrick or any pop or hip hop concert. There'll be an interpreter at the front of the stage signing the music, signing the song. So that's what people often think of. That's a type of sign language music called a translated song, or I like to call them cover songs. Then there are translated or cover songs that are not done live, they're recorded. Those are kind of a little bit different because then you can use like video editing techniques, have a more kind of polished performance. And those are posted online, usually places like YouTube, Vimeo, TikTok now, Instagram, places like that. And then there are other genres of signed music that don't have an oral equivalent. So, for example, original signed music doesn't have an original oral piece of music that it's tied to. So, it's not translating anything, it's creating music in sign language. And another related type of sign language music is called a percussion song. These are traditional songs. They're not created very much anymore, but these are traditional songs that use a specific rhythm and they're very repetitive and rhythmic. They're sometimes used as fight songs. And then there's another kind of separate genre called dip hop, which is deaf hip hop. That's rapping in sign language. Usually there's an oral component to that too, but it's an original oral component. So the sign language rap and the oral rap are both original.
You can't come with me. I'm like whatever Tom and Jerry keep me company. It's in that caption, but I had action glued to the show. Got me laughing times up. Pop said the mama's on the way. Sit out the door and wait. I just said okay. Soon as I stepped out, I felt the door slam.
So those are the kind of basic types of sign language music. And that's what I study is music that is created in sign language in one of these genres. So I do study music from all across all of these genres.
What sparked your interest in signed music, deaf culture, and this particular interaction of music and disability studies?
I have a classical training. I went to McGill. I got my bachelor's in music. I started out as a flutist. I studied classical music. I specifically specialized in contemporary music, 20th, 21st century music. And then I went and got my master's in music theory at McGill as well. So just to say, I didn't start out with this interest in mind. I had a kind of a typical classical training. When I was in my master's, I've always been interested in languages. So growing up, I always was interested in learning languages. And so one interest of mine was learning American Sign Language. So I was learning that kind of just on my own outside of the university setting. And while I was learning ASL, I was looking up all kinds of resources online. There weren't as many resources back then in around 2011. And one thing that I found a lot of as I was searching through YouTube and other sites, I started to find a lot of people making translations of pop songs in American Sign Language. And I thought that was really interesting. As a musician, I thought it was kind of a fascinating thing, but I didn't really look very deeply into it until I started to take a seminar with Nicole Biamonte, who's still at McGill. It was a seminar on popular music. I think it's actually on rock music. So, not really a type of music that I was particularly interested in studying more, but I wanted to take a class on it. I had never taken a class on pop music before because I had really been very classically trained. And so I was trying to think, what am I going to study in this class, for my final paper? I want to do a good final project, but none of this music is really grabbing me  the way that the other music that I study is really I'm really interested in. But then I had a realization that the music that I was watching, these music videos that I was watching, were pop songs, right? And they were being translated into gesture in this way that I found fascinating. And one thing that I found fascinating, I was already interested in music and gesture, the relationship between our movements and the music that we produce. But this seemed to me a fascinating opportunity to study really specifically what changes about our gestures, our movements, when they're put into a musical context. Because I knew what these signs looked like in a conversational setting, but then they were very obviously different when someone was signing with the music. And so I thought, well, here's a chance for me to look at what changes exactly about a sign, what changes about our movement when we put it in this context of being musical. And so that's what started it all. And that became my first article back in 2013. But it really was a springboard for this whole world of deaf studies and disability studies that I just fell in love with and became very, very passionate about, and really worked in all throughout my PhD, even though my dissertation was not on disability studies or sign language or deaf studies. It was on a completely different topic, but all throughout I couldn't leave this area behind. I just kept being fascinated by it in so many different ways. The history of music in deaf culture and deaf education was fascinating to me. Going out into the community and meeting people who were making this music was fascinating to me. It really is just kind of a series of coincidences and things that just allowed me to kind of follow this thread, this passion that I had, and kind of made me realize that this was what I was really actually interested in working on.
And you start in your book with really essential background for someone like me who read it not knowing anything. Like I know thank you in American Sign Language, and that's it. You talk about the history of deaf education specifically,
Yeah.
and comparing two schools of thought: the oralist, teaching people to speak, Alexander Graham Bell sort of thing, and the manualist, which is the teaching of signing. And the oralists do not come across that hot in the first chapter or even throughout the book. You start here not just to give us a background, but I think this dichotomy really is crucial to understanding the culture in which sign language music emerges from. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Anyone who knows anything about deaf history, deaf studies will know this kind of battle between manualism and oralism in the 19th century. Oralism really comes about as a desire to assimilate deaf people into this kind of hearing world through teaching lip reading and speech, and really not encouraging the use of sign languages. And so, out of this kind of oppressive force of oralism in the late 19th century, kind of ironically emerged actually a really rich and vibrant deaf culture because of this, partly because of this kind of oppression that happened, where deaf culture had to kind of find its way against this kind of oppressive force. Also, as a result of oralism, we don't have a lot of great records of sign language music from the late 19th century and early 20th century, unfortunately. With oralism, again, the idea was assimilation. So the same was true with music. So there was this idea that if deaf people could be made to experience music, listen to music like everybody else, like hearing people, then that would be like a real true sign that they were assimilated into the hearing world. And so there was a lot of focus on technological innovations, which, late 19th century, this was the time for these innovations in sound recording, telephones, right? Alexander Graham Bell was very heavily involved in this. He was an oralist and a eugenicist. He was one of the people kind of trying to create these technologies to help deaf people hear normally, quote unquote. Music was tied up with all of this at that time. This kind of push to assimilate deaf people, to cure their deafness with technologies, and to make them hear specifically music normally. This created a difficult relationship between a lot of deaf people in the early 20th century and music, because music was often used as something really negative, right? It was kind of forced on them. Their experiments were done on deaf people. like sonic experiments, trying to see what would work to get them to hear more. And these were often very painful, awful experiments that were done. And just in general, this kind of oralist culture was really strongly associated with music. There's still, I think, some tension there is music a hearing thing? Is it part of the hearing world exclusively, or is it also part of the deaf world? And I think that a younger generation now of deaf and hard of hearing people is much more kind of open to music in lots of different ways. But I think there's still a kind of a tension there that originates in the oralist movement.
Several of your interviewees for the volume did mention kind of a deep dislike for hearing folks who kind of like maybe learned ASL in a semester or two of college doing covers, doing these interpretations. Quote from Rosalie Tim really stood out to me. Their priority is sound. They're dropping the ASL grammar because they're so busy listening for the wrong reasons. So there still is this thread of like, there is a right way and a wrong way to engage with the music because the music comes out of a culture. So what are some of the best practices for hearing folks to respectfully engage with this music?
Well, one of the purposes of my book is to highlight deaf musicians, deaf performers, and hard of hearing musicians and performers. And I think always making sure that we're giving deaf and hard of hearing musicians and performers that platform first, giving them, that exposure. And a lot of the time the eyes are on the hearing interpreters, right? The first example I mentioned was concert interpretation. There are deaf interpreters who interpret at concerts, but a lot of the times the ones who go viral, those are hearing interpreters. And so all the eyes are on them, all the focus. And that doesn't mean just that they get all the attention, they get more jobs, they get more money. There's a huge problem already in North America with disabled people not getting jobs, right? Like not being employed. Thing number one is really giving these opportunities to deaf and hard of hearing people so that they do have these opportunities to spread their work, their art, their culture, and also so that they just get the jobs, they just get the opportunities, right? In terms of hearing people creating sign language music, I think a lot of people that I interviewed for this book acknowledge that there is a place for hearing interpreters creating music, especially concert interpretation, that kind of thing. But they just wanted the more of the focus to be on the deaf and hard of hearing people spreading their own music, their own culture. The real issue is hearing people going online and spreading incorrect ASL or signing music or signing in general when they are not nearly fluent, right? They're just learning. And this is a real issue, especially on like TikTok, where you get people who really should not in any way be teaching a sign language at all. And they are posting ASL covers and they're posting, word of the day, sign of the day. Even if you are an ASL interpreter, you shouldn't be teaching ASL. But if you're not an ASL interpreter, you certainly shouldn't be posting, covers and having them be a model for other people to follow. So, I think it's okay. Like you're taking an ASL class, you want to do a cover of a song. Like, I think that's great and that's fine, but maybe don't, boost it to your TikTok followers and give the impression that this is what sign language music is. It's a complicated issue. It's very complex. I don't think there's kind of a one size fits all solution or, some advice that I can really give other than just be really careful. If you're not part of this culture, just be really careful to, with what you post online, and be aware that of how it might be read by others if you're going to be posting like ASL songs. Just be aware of the context of what you're doing. Yeah.
Reading the metaphorical realm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sign language music is not, as you mentioned earlier, dividing it into different subgenres, if you will.
Yeah.
It's not just translation. It's this transformative thing when done right, because there are all these non-lyrical aspects of music timbre, register dynamics. I was wondering when I was reading because you mentioned that sign language music is not just signing along. The signs are transformed themselves. The signs become slightly different. I was wondering about if there's kind of an emerging sign language music common practice, if there's a specific melodic gesture that happens in an instrumental piece, and you have several different interpreters. Could they be expected to do similar things for certain like aspects of the music that are nonverbal?
I try to get away in my work from this kind of like direct one-to-one comparison between like the sounding music and the signed music and kind of trying to find correlations. Instead, I treat signed music, including translated signed music, as a piece of music in its own right. So that's why I call translated songs, I call them cover songs. Because to me, that highlights, if you listen to a cover song, if you listen to Hallelujah, right, but covered by Rufus Wainwright, it's its own song in its own right. You don't always tie it back every moment to Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, right? You think of it as its own song in some way. And so that's how I like to think about translated ASL songs too. It's just that they happen to be performed simultaneously with the original, which kind of complicates things, especially if you are hearing and you're hearing the song at the same time as you're seeing it. So that can introduce a lot of complexity when you're kind of listening and watching in multiple mediums at the same time. But actually, in my chapter on melody in the book, I do talk about how there are melodic commonalities between different covers of the same song. So I talk about the Star Spangled Banner. Star Spangled Banner has been signed a lot of times, especially since the early 90s when it started to be incorporated into the Super Bowl every year, having ASL translation in the Super Bowl by deaf and hard of hearing performers. There's a rather large corpus to study there. And what I did find was that there is commonality in the kind of what I call the melody, the dynamic use of space in each of the covers. So there are particular movements that are used, and then there are other movements that are never used in covers of that song. And so I think that indicates to me that there is a sense of kind of a common melodic path for this song. But again, it doesn't really correspond with the oral version in any kind of meaningful way, right? It's not that it's like higher when the notes are higher in the oral music or something, because ASL uses, three-dimensional space, right? So it's using movements out and in as well as up and down, and that's not corresponding somehow with the oral music. But it is its own melody, right? It's its own distinctive melody in the ASL.
I mean, you talk about melody, you talk about the cross-domain mapping of pitch equals height. That really fascinated me, think about the three dimensions of space, because there is potential for that to really, when reapplied back to hearing musicians, totally change the way that we conceive of and use metaphors for melody. Like, what does thinking about melody in three dimensions really mean for a hearing musician?
Yeah, I mean, I love the three-dimensional aspect of signed music is, I think one of the really special features of it, the way that signing musicians can use the space. People will compare signed music to oral music and they'll say, like it doesn't have timbre, it doesn't have, it's not as complex in terms of, all these things. I say, well, oral music isn't as complex in the use of three-dimensional space, right? Like, right? You can't compare them in that way. It's not productive.
Talking about dip hop as like its own separate genre, it's something that gets a lot of focus in your work, because hip hop, like traditionally, like there's a strong like tradition of cranking the bass. Like you pull up next to somebody at an intersection, their car's rattling, your car's rattling. My first instinct there is to think this person's not being very like considerate of other people. And the second thought I have is they're going to go deaf. But now, having read your book, now my thought is maybe they are deaf. Like maybe they're experiencing the physical vibrations of this as a way to experience music without the use of ears. There has to be more than the physical sensation of that beat that gives dip hop such a unique appeal.
I think a lot of the appeal of dip hop is similar to the appeal of hip hop. It's the people, the personalities, right? We think of rappers, right? And you don't just think of them kind of neutrally composing music, right? You think of them as they're kind of characters, right? In a way, right? They have these personas that they develop. And I think there's a little bit of that in the dip hop world as well. We have these kind of personas who produce different kinds of rap. I think another big part of it is the fact that it's signed and rapped at the same time, but it's not a translation in the sense of like cover songs, right? Because it's all written by the same person. Now, it's not always performed simultaneously by the same person. So it sometimes it's the same person vocalizing the rap and signing it, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's somebody else is voicing the rap. But I think that kind of multilingual aspect of it, that the fact that it's an original rap performed simultaneously in two languages, I think is very appealing. And then just the rhythmic complexity that you see in the signs, it's the same, I think, as when you listen to oral rap, the rhythmic complexity is what really grabs listeners. You're listening for these rhymes, you're listening for where the rhymes are placed, you're listening for how the rapper kind of plays with the meter, where they place stresses, and then just clever wordplay, right? And there's an aspect of rapid fire delivery as well. All of those things are very easily translated into sign languages. So the rapid fire delivery, rhymes, right? So there's rhyming in sign languages, just like there is in spoken languages. It it operates a little bit differently, which I'm happy to explain for your viewers.
That was my next question
Oh,
about
was it?
how rhymes
Okay.
work with these. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So rhymes. So you can have rhymes in a number of different parameters in American Sign Language. So the parameters that we have are hand shape. So there's different hand shapes in sign languages. So for like, let's just take like an open 5. That's a hand shape, for example, or a 1 hand shape. It's a 1 hand shape. So different hand shapes. There's different orientations. So there's the way that your hand is facing, right? Can be different. There's different locations that you can have a sign in. So for example, you can have signs in different places on your face or on your body, and there's different movements, right? So a sign could be like stationary, or it could move in a certain direction. And then there's non-manual markers as well. So those are things like facial expressions and mouth movements, things like that. So a sign can rhyme in any of those parameters. So for example, and again, I'm not teaching ASL here, I just try to give a summary of rhyme. But for example, the signs mother and father rhyme. So they have the same hand shape, which is this hand shape, and the same orientation, which is this orientation. This is mother, and this is father. So they just differ in terms of their location, right? So one is signed on the chin and one is signed on the forehead. So you can see that those two signs would rhyme in multiple ways, but they differ in their location. That's basically how it works in ASL.
I want to move on to maybe the most potentially controversial thing that you talked about in your book, which are the examples of, as you alluded to earlier, original sign language music that has no sonic component at all. It's doubtless an art form, but why call it music as opposed to something like visual poetry?
So there is a tradition of poetry in American Sign Language, a rich, amazing tradition that goes back a long, long way. And there's also dance, right? There's a long tradition of deaf dancers. So a lot of people also compare it to dance. That's why I bring up dance. So there are a few reasons why I call it music. The biggest one, the most important one, is that the people doing it call it music, right? So I don't think I would be a responsible ethnographer and music researcher if I didn't respect the culture that I was stepping into. The people in that culture call it music. And so to me, that means it's music. I get a lot of pushback on that, but I just firmly think that if a culture says that something is music or isn't music, then you need to respect that, right? There's cultures around the world that produce things that we would say is music, but they don't call it music. And we respect that. Just like there are cultures around the world where music and dance aren't separate or separable in some kind of meaningful way. They're the same, they're together, and we respect that. Another thing I will say, though, is that there are meaningful and perceptible differences between each of these art forms, because I do get this question a lot. I like to show different examples. I always have them in my back pocket of a piece of sign language poetry, sign language dance that is kind of a hybrid. I like to show kind of a hybrid dance music hybrid. And then, obviously I've already usually shown them examples of sign language music as well. And usually people can pick up right away that there are obvious surface level differences between, say, sign language poetry and sign language music. The ones that musicians pick up on first is meter, especially. So there's usually not a perceptible regular meter that's expressed in sign language poetry. Usually it's much more kind of metrically free. If you do get a sense of meter, it's usually pretty fleeting, and then it's just kind of free. And then also just kind of regular and repetitive rhythms. So usually you don't see that in ASL poetry. ASL poetry is usually at a faster speed. So sign music is quite a bit slower in tempo generally. I mean, obviously there are exceptions like with hip hop, right, where it's all about speed in some ways, some kinds of hip hop. But in general, when you look at original signed music versus original signed poetry, the original signed music will be slower than the original signed poetry. And then with dance, the really obvious difference is usually that it uses the entire body versus ASL music uses just what's called the normal or conversational signing space. So it doesn't go below the waist ever. But sign dance uses the whole body, uses a lot more movements that are not grammatically regulated in sign languages, movements that are like derived from, specific types of dance. Beyond just my kind of cultural argument, my ethnographer's argument that you should respect the culture that you're looking at, that you're kind of entering into as an outsider, I think that there are also very obvious kind of perceptual differences between these genres.
There is a very perceptible beat in dip hop that you can push and pull around with the signs exactly in the way that one pushes and pulls around a beat to create a flow. Not that everything has to be exactly that metrical, but that there is an underlying metrical pulse.
There is a pulse, a regular pulse that you can entrain to in, I think, all signed music. I think that's pretty much a feature of like every piece of signed music I've ever seen that's identified as music, that has some kind of pulse that you can entrain to. Sometimes you'll get a much more flexible kind of conception of meter, where it's more of, you can identify maybe changes in meter. And sometimes you'll get a much more kind of stable, steady meter. So there's variations, just like in oral music, right, within the way that meter is used. But generally you can kind of perceive a pulse. It's a visual pulse, right? It's a visually perceived pulse, but it's a pulse nonetheless. And I mean, there's lots of studies that show that we can perceive a visual pulse just as we can perceive a pulse orally as well.
You mentioned earlier, when you at the very top of the show, percussion songs. Those are the ones that are come from like more the earlier days that are not as well documented. Was that absorbed into this? Did that just die off? Like what really happened to that as a genre?
Percussion songs are performed still, but they're really only performed, I think, in the context of like fight songs for sports teams. So Gallaudet University has a fight song called the Bison Song, which is a percussion song that's performed regularly. These songs are still used and performed, but the genre, I would say, it's not developing, or it hasn't developed more. You could say that maybe dip hop is kind of linked to percussion songs in the fact that it's very rhythmic. It's very much about rhythm. Percussion songs, they originated, as far as I know, and right, we don't have great records, originated in the early 20th century. The first ones that we have really filmed are from the 1930s. There's not loads of them out there. Part of it is that it relies on the medium of video taping, right? And that wasn't something that was really accessible to a lot of people for much of the 20th century, right? So it's only in the latter part of the 20th century that you start to get home video recording. And so you get to see more of people's lives than before on videotape. So yeah, I would say that the genre is not really very active now, but maybe it has kind of been a part of forming genres like dip hop.
When you say your first article on this was published 2011,
2013.
2013. I
2013.
cannot remember numbers for the life of me, so I got within a couple of years. That's good for me. So in that time, how has your relationship to music, like oral music, changed through your studies of sign music?
One of the things I really emphasize in the introduction to the book is that all music is multisensory, right? So you use all your senses that you have available to you all the time, including when you're listening to music. Even if you're listening to music, on headphones, using headphones, listening to a recording, you're still using your eyes, and you're still using your sense of smell and your sense of touch, right? And that's especially true when you go listen to live music. You're also feeling vibrations. You might just not attend to it as much, right? You're also using your eyes. You're watching, you're watching the conductor, you're watching the musicians. And again, you might not attend to that as being musical, but it's part of how you experience music. Working on this over the past 12 years has really shaped the way that I listen to music now, in using all of my senses and trying to focus on different senses as I'm listening to music, and what that brings to one's experience of any kind of music. I think it absolutely, has very much changed the way that I think about music. And disability studies in general has changed the way that I think about music, changed my relationship to music theory, the concepts of music theory. So yeah, it has very much shaped my approach to everything. Yeah, when it comes to music.
Once again, thank you for coming on.
Thank
Book is
you for having
Sing
me.
Voices, Analyzing Sign Language Music from Oxford University Press. Get it from your library, because if I know anything about academic publishing, you're not seeing a cent from whatever sales are happening.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But I appreciate anyone who does buy a copy. And of course, yes, if you get it from your library as well, that's awesome. I'm just happy to know that people are reading it and interested in it. And that's all that matters.